Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Carl Larson from RMCG, and we'll be hosting today's session on carbon management in vegetable farms. And we're going to be talking about emissions, sequestration, and beyond. So a very hot topic at the moment, both in the media and at the industry level, obviously with all the climate talks in Glasgow that have just finished up. But we're really pleased to bring you this session as part of the soil wealth and integrated crop protection projects delivered by RMCG and our partners, Applied Horticultural Research, and funded through the Vegetable R&D Levy with contribution from the Australian Government. Before I introduce our speakers and panellists today, which we've got a star-studded lineup of, I just wanted to briefly give an overview of what we're going to cover. We'll start with Doris Blasing and Isabel Axio giving us an overview of the role and importance of soil carbon in vegetable production, and actually why growers should care about it before we look at things like how do you calculate an emissions profile for your business. We're then going to hand over to our second speaker, Clinton Muller, who I'll introduce very shortly, around opportunities for vegetables under the Emissions Reduction Fund, and really trying to, I guess, piece together the jigsaw as it stands at the moment around opportunities with that particular scheme and the carbon market as well. So if you haven't joined one of our sessions before or the go-to platform, there's a spot to put your questions in. Importantly, send those through when they come to mind. They'll come directly to me and we can put them to our presenters and panelists throughout the session. And we've also got a pane there on your control panel with handouts, some really practical R&D resources there on things like the role of carbon in soils, biochar, some fert care resources as well. You can just click on those and take them away with you at the end of the session rather than following any long or complex URLs, because they're always hard to type in after the session. Before we do start though, we just want to get a sense. We've got about 50 people joining us from around the country and also overseas. We're really keen to hear your level of experience in carbon management and vegetable production. There's a poll that's just come up on your screen there. If you wouldn't mind selecting one of the four options there, all anonymous, but just letting us know how much experience you've got with carbon management. That gives us a bit of an idea about where to pitch some of the presentations and acronyms, because there's plenty of those when you get into the detail, and we'll make sure we explain those. So we've got just over half voted. Keep those coming in, and I'll be able to share back the results with everyone too, just to give us an idea of who's on the line. Alrighty, so about 3/4 of us have voted. I'm going to close that off and just share back the results with everyone. Okay, interesting. We've got a really strong cohort in the middle there around experience. So a bit or not much. It covers about 70% of us online. So that's really good to know. We've got a few with lots, but also almost a quarter, none but keen to know more. So that's really great just to see that breadth. And we'll make sure we take that into account when we're presenting some of the information. Alrighty, so just a little bit about the Soil Wealth and Integrated Crop Protection Project. This is an extension-based project in the veggie industry funded by Hort Innovation, as I mentioned, all about improving soil management and plant health. A real focus on getting research to practice out on farms. So we've been working directly with veggie growers and advisors now for 7 years under phase 1 and almost towards the end of phase 2 now. We've got national coverage, a number of different demonstration sites and events like today, as well as technical resources that really aim to distill down the so what and what's in it for the levy payer and grower. And we'll, as I mentioned, have a number of those resources available for you today and a recording of this session to take away. So feel free to share those with your colleagues, friends, family as well. So now on to our speakers and panelists, and I've briefly introduced some of those. I'd like to introduce my colleagues from RMCG. We've got Dr. Doris Blasing and Isabel Axio joining us from across Bass Strait in Launceston in Tasmania, so welcome. Great to see your smiling faces. We've got Clinton Muller just outside Melbourne in the hills, joining us in Victoria. And we're also really lucky to have our panellists too, Dr. Francois from Carbon Friendly based in Brisbane, and also Anthony Houston from Houston's Farms based down just outside of Hobart in Tasmania as well. So welcome to all our speakers and panellists. We're going to start with a presentation from Doris and Isabel. I'm going to just share their screen now, so bear with me while I do that. All right, so Doris and Isabel, there should be a screen request coming through. And while we're bringing that up for you, they're going to speak to us about the importance of carbon in vegetable production systems, and also why it's important to take care of it, steward it, build it, but also cover how to develop an emissions profile for your farm as well. So Isabel, is that coming up at your end?
It hasn't come through, Carl. Do you want to try again? Just tried it. It worked so well the first time.
Oh, that's all right. Here we go. Let's try that one again.
Oh, good.
After 18 months of pandemic, technology still can prove tricky, but we can see your screen now and the full slide. So over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for joining the webinar. So Isabel and I will talk a bit of Carbon 101 and try to go, especially for the experienced one, into maybe 102 and 103. But really the questions are on the screen, you know, why is it important? Why care about emissions? And maybe how could you calculate emissions? So we will touch on that, and then Clinton will get into the heavy stuff about joining the emission reduction scheme.
So just before we kick on to that, I would just like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Palawa of Lutwicha, Tasmania, where Doris and I are today.
I guess what's all the fuss about? It seems to be there was a fuss 12 years ago or 10 years ago, and we'll be fussing again, and it's just as confusing as the first time round. So I think we talked a lot about soil carbon to our audience and the importance of soil carbon, but just we're going to rehash that quickly. And then what are carbon emissions and why should we care? And certainly Isabel will talk a little bit about sequestration and what are the benefits of sequestration, what does it actually mean? And we're throwing some words around. We hear about footprints, we hear about carbon neutral adaptation, mitigation. One that I like from experience in this sector is productivity. A good outcome and takeaway for me has been that low emissions means high productivity in a agriculture business. So that's the good news up front.
And also just to highlight that it's not one or the other of those points there, but a combination of all of them.
So there's a few facts which we sometimes forget. To me, one of the really important facts is that the only way of sequestering carbon and getting carbon into soil, whether it's for the emission reduction scheme or for the benefit of the company, is growing plants. Plants, there's some other tricks people try to do, but the only way we can get carbon into soils and carbon out of the atmosphere are plants. It seems to be often forgotten that it's a fascinating and simple, it's not simple, but it's one way of doing it. We need to cover the soil in plants.
Simple concept, a complex reality.
Yes. And also it's really interesting if you look at carbon stocks, how much carbon is actually stored in soils, even in some of the soils that look depleted. But there's been a lot of work done, including by the CSIRO, to actually have a look at how much carbon is in the soil and how much carbon can be stored. And that's probably something we have to, and we, Isabel and I will get back to, is there's a limit on how much carbon can be stored in certain soils. So we can't trick ourselves and talk about going wild with carbon storage. So we will talk a bit about that. And Isabel, you are going to make a point?
Yeah, well, I think the two last points on this slide, both that the process is reversible, which I think creates a lot of fear and caution naturally from the industry. So of course you can build your soil carbon, but unless you maintain practices, a product can also be reversible. And the final one is kind of perversely the accreditation schemes of the process is will give you the most return on investment where you have the poorest soil. So you start with something very low, then you've got further to go. So your ability to participate increases, but then there's the soil health side of that, which doesn't always follow.
Yeah, and there's a business return side. I often find trying to improve the poorest soil is maybe throwing good money after bad. But anyway, that's a discussion for another time. But just remember that there are different drivers for having, looking after soil carbon. So interesting also in agriculture, in irrigated agriculture, which we're talking about, a high percentage of total emissions come from use of nitrogen fertilizer and the not so good use of nitrogen fertilizer. Because, and I'll explain actually later a bit more, that nitrous oxide emissions are very strong greenhouse gases, and they're converted to carbon equivalent. So we actually using, for instance, high levels or high amounts of nitrate fertilizer and then irrigating happily, we might actually lose a lot of it as emissions in their greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a lot a business can do by managing nitrogen well. And there are quite a few resources. If you can't find them on the Soil website, we certainly have resources on managing nitrogen and nitrogen emissions.
I might just keeping in mind some of those polls there. So might just break down the three greenhouse gases there is. So we've got carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. Now, later, everybody talks about carbon dioxide equivalent. So as Doris mentioned, methane is more potent than carbon dioxide by about 28%. And we've got nitrous oxide, which I think is about 250 times more potent. So those more potent gases are then converted back into the equivalent of carbon dioxide. So we've got 1 unit to measure that emission. So that's what we mean when we talk about a carbon dioxide equivalent, which then also relates to an ACCI, which Clinton will talk about.
Which is another word. And of course, for anybody who's got livestock, they are the big emitters. However, a lot can be done, and there's a lot of work has been done and is ongoing to reduce emissions from livestock, but we won't get into that in more detail. And of course, burning anything is bad because you burn organic matter, which is partly a carbon. I mean, I would think most of you know why better soil carbon is a good idea. Sometimes I ask people, what's the difference between soil carbon and organic matter? Organic matter is basically 50% carbon. And in some older literature, they talk about a factor of 1.74, but actually 2 is by now recognized as, and it's easier to remember. The organic matter, half of that is carbon, and the other half are mainly nutrients.
There's the co-benefit of that organic matter. So we talk about organic matter, but organic matter isn't that interesting. But I guess what farmers is really interested in is that reduction of energy or fertilizer use that might be corresponding with an increase in soil organic matter, or the other points.
And quite often we're talking about, for instance, adding compost, and compost would add nutrients, but really looking at the actual science of it, unless the compost is made with manure or biosolids, it actually doesn't have many nutrients, but it does improve the nutrient holding capacity and the nutrient cycling. So it has a really positive nutrition effect, but that's not necessarily due to nutrients in the organic matter or compost. So it really changes how the soil functions in every way. I call organic matter black magic. I think it's fantastic. So maybe Isabel, you want to talk about the market benefits?
So I'll just briefly mention that our panelist here today will be the better representative for what the potential market benefits can be. But I guess there's the key, and we come from the soil health perspective, of increasing your soil organic matter and your carbon sequestration, and that is in that productivity and sustainable management of your farm and the reduction of inputs. But the other side of that is preparing for a future, so that the market benefits here in these 3 points talk about promoting those sustainable practices. So being able to put on your produce that you've sequestered carbon, you've reduced emissions, maybe you're carbon neutral, and what that gives you as a market advantage. And then there's the other 2 points in terms of resilience. So whilst you might choose to not participate in a market like that, what happens in the future if the customers actually start demanding that? Are we going to be ready? Do we know what it means? So being prepared, being resilient for that future market demand, but also being prepared for a future climate demand. So we know that climate is changing, and some of the co-benefits again of more sustainable management and of building soil carbon in your soil is being more resilient to things like drought, big rain events, and that is a great benefit. And the third one is that risk mitigation. So whether or not it is a priority within your land, we see in other industries such as dairy industry and the meat and livestock industry, those peak industries are setting targets, whether or not our governments choose to. And so again, being ahead of the game, being prepared for what is likely going to be a focus into the future.
And also, again, we talked about better water holding capacity by having more organic matter. And we also saw that irrigation and pumping costs are one of the big emitters. So that also makes sense to actually reduce emissions in many ways by having the benefits from carbon. This is a picture that was actually a panel. I've been here talking not only to vegetable growers but also to fruit growers. And we did a bit of a fun thing to actually measure soil health and the benefits of carbon. And you can see it's only about in September where some brave guys buried. Hopefully not. They weren't there on Andes. I was there, so they were not. However, it's just a really fun thing to do. You can also use a hanky if you like to see how well the carbon in your soil or the organic matter actually works, because it does feed soil life, and the soil life will also eat a cotton or calico bit of cloth. And I was really amused seeing the ultra discs there with all their different expression of organic matter, and one of them didn't do very well, and he is missing on the picture. So I thought it's quite funny to see that one Andy lying there and being not liked. So anyway, so you can quite easily check your carbon levels and your microbiology by some fun things you can do. Now we come back to the science, how to sequester soil carbon. We said, increase photosynthesis. So always have something growing as much as you can everywhere. So fallow is not a good idea for many reasons. Obviously, there are systems, and Clinton talk about that, having permanent vegetation, more permanent vegetation, growing good crops. As we said, if it's the plants who are capturing the carbon or the carbon dioxide, grow good crops, good biomass, good root systems. So that's really important. But also be wise with inputs to grow them. Often, we did some work on nitrogen use efficiency, and we had some very sad results. So there's certainly room for improvement. Organic amendments can be used. And we said before, not every soil can accumulate the same amount of carbon. So it's a bit unfair when we talk about the ERF as well. If you're in a hot climate, that's why deserts don't have much carbon, because it's hot or cold and dry. So if any conditions are not good to grow biomass, they're not good for accumulating carbon. So it's basically as simple as that. So you can try to import compost organic amendments, but they also use themselves up very quickly, unfortunately. So you're better off being in Tasmania.
And then there's the other one where maybe you already have amazing soil. I remember Doris and I were on Flinders Island, which has some almost peachy soils where the soil organic carbon already sits around 13 to 15%. So their ability to go higher is not really there.
No, and we have got some very good managers in the vegetable industry where unfortunately, they have nearly reached the limit of how much carbon they can accumulate in their soil. So they're also, I mean, they have all the other benefits, but and you know, participation might be a problem. There has been a change over the years in the ERF, and Clinton can talk about that. Is initially sequestration was only at the place of where sequestered, so compost was actually not counted as a sequestration method, because if you buy it, it's not you sequestering but somebody else. Anyway, that has changed, so that's probably good. Just again to show how you can increase or lose organic carbon. So obviously keeping the soil covered, we said, is good. Whatever cover crops, so reducing the amount of naked soil. And probably one of the worst, which people forget, is fallow, is having nothing growing, because microorganisms still use up carbon. And of course tillage, because it aerates the soil, is also losing carbon. So you can see that in vegetable production systems, especially if you grow baby leaf lettuce and have lots of rotations, it is just really hard to keep carbon levels up.
But we are seeing some good examples of practice change, definitely within this project, in terms of maybe not using all of those. Obviously, vegetable growers can't grow pastures, but where you do reduce the tillage and you retain your stubble and you might do integrated crops, those soil carbon levels are increasing.
I just thought I'd show this picture. We work with one landholder, and every brown bar going up or down are some of his paddocks, one of his paddocks, and we looked at you know, the carbon trend for each of these paddocks. So he was one of those good people who had big folders with all his soil tests. So I got the poor person to enter all these soil test results for carbon. So it was just a normal carbon test, 0 to 10 centimeters, into a spreadsheet, and you could see that a lot of the paddocks had lost carbon over time. And part of the issue is quite a heavy rotation in most paddocks with potatoes, carrots, and onions. All of them are pretty hard on the soil, especially potatoes. And you see a few of the paddocks had actually accumulated carbon, and there were the paddocks. This is a Tasmanian farm with some undulating land. The steeper land, obviously not suitable for cropping, were put down to pasture, and they actually accumulated carbon. The ones that are the worst in losing carbon were initially the best paddocks, the best soil, heavily used for cropping. So that was just a snapshot, just using, you know, a farmer's data. So there are quite a few things you can do if you have some data to actually look and assess your business. And we've done a lot of the emission reduction plans for actually checking the different parts of the business and where carbon is lost and where it's accumulated. So it's Isabel explained, so it's something we prepared earlier when we tried to explain the different greenhouse gases. We invented our little helpers, which nitrous Nelly and the methane man and the carbon kit. So the carbon kit is actually small because, you know, if you look, carbon is a greenhouse gas we will talk about, but as Isabel explained, it's not as potent as methane because we've got big methane man there, and nitrous oxide is quite potent. But interestingly, the thinking about nitrous oxide also has changed because it doesn't hang around as long as some others. So that we'll be learning more about, yes, it is far more potent, but it also disappears more quickly from the atmosphere. So still keeping learning. You want to talk about,
yeah, so there's some existing carbon calculators tools, and I guess one thing to consider with carbon calculator tools is that they often focus on emissions only. And I definitely know that most farmers on this call are already considering efficiencies in their production system. And so the emissions is probably not where the most interest going forward is, but it is more on that sequestration side. But of course, you can only sequester once you know your emissions too. So both sides of the puzzles are good. We've included a link here for a vegetable emission carbon calculator tool, and also a link to the landscape option and opportunities for carbon abatement calculator, which just offers farmers that ability to have a first go to assess your own farm. Where is the emissions being generated, and roughly how much is it? And that landscape tool, which is by CSIRO, offers you the ability to consider your existing soil carbon levels and the potential of that if you increase it by a certain amount. So there's just some tools to give you that first grasp of what's going on your farm, to look at both emissions and also those sequestration opportunities.
And certainly, when we did look at irrigated cropping, pumping costs were one of the highest, and even we in one company we just basically changed all the lighting and looked at cool room insulation, and there's some interesting things when you do a overview of the business in what are the emissions and what are the sequestration options. Carbon footprinting, we talked about that briefly before. You want to explain the footprinting, Isabel?
Yeah, I mean, I see it as the way, how big is the business as it kind of lands on the earth. But I think a key thing to consider with footprinting, additional to your emissions and your sort of land impact, is that it does include the supply chain. So it will refer to something called Scope 3, which again, Clinton will cover. And you can use your carbon calculators to give you that first grab of understanding your footprint. And when you know your footprint, that's when you can also take the next step, if you will, to consider what it takes to become carbon neutral.
So the footprint is really a life cycle assessment where you look at all the ins and outs. So for instance, using a high amount of nitrogen fertilizers produced with very high energy input, and then using it inefficiently certainly gives you a bit step ahead of the footprint. Or producing, having inputs that are transported from far away and transporting your own product far away will unfortunately increase the footprint.
But if you do the calculation, it will give you the the tools to consider. Oh, maybe I should consider a shorter transportation or slightly more efficient application.
And that's again, having more soil carbon will help with it.
It will.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's it from us.
Yeah, that is from us. Hopefully, if there's any questions, we can get back to that. But thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Doris and Isabel. A really great overview of carbon in the system, but also some of those tips and tools that are readily available to growers and agronomists on the line. We're going to switch over now to our second speaker, Clinton Muller. So Clinton, I'll just share your screen and just do a very brief introduction while you're bringing that up. So Clinton's going to talk to us about opportunities for vegetable growers in the Emissions Reduction Fund, and actually when participating in that ERF or Emissions Reduction Fund might actually be a viable option. Clinton, welcome. We can see your presentation, so over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Carl, and g'day everyone, and thank you for having me along today. I think I've drawn the short straw in the conversation about what are these opportunities under the Emissions Reduction Fund. So I've certainly structured this whole talk around navigating soil carbon projects for vegetable producers, but I'd certainly add that there are a lot of rabbit holes. So I'm hoping that we can just spend the next couple of minutes running through what the process is and hopefully alleviating some of the pain of the rabbit holes I might have encountered in the process so far. I guess some context about why I'm particularly speaking about this is I took a sabbatical about 12 months ago from RMCG to take a really deep dive in this space and certainly really explored what restoration and carbon sequestration scales to be, and became very familiar with methodologies under the Emission Reduction Fund and particularly the above ground and below ground methodologies, which I'll talk about. Just before I get underway, I just wanted to acknowledge some of the aggregators that really provide some input into the discussion I had today. So certainly up in Queensland, Terry McCosker from Carbon Link, Louise Edmonds over in WA with Carbon Sync, and Teresa Tapman as well in Tassie, who's doing her PhD with UTAS and doing some work with AgriProve as well. Certainly helped round out some of my thinking and assumptions around what are the opportunities for vegetable growers. So I'll jump straight into it. With a bit of a reminder about why we need to generate carbon credits. So this image is a carbon budget for Australia. It's back from the period of 1990 to 2011. and includes all the carbon flows in fossil fuel emissions. So this includes things like fires as well, and emissions from land use change. And if we can't reduce or eliminate all these emissions, we need to look at offsets. But I think the other important aspect we need to consider as well, we need to think about drawdown as well of excess carbon that's already in the atmosphere. And the real opportunity here is the carbon that is stored and captured by vegetation and soil. So that's really what we're talking about here when we talk about carbon credits and the opportunity for producers to engage in. So I guess let's talk business. How do we monetize this? Because I think this is the big question we hear all the time about, it's really important to sequester and store carbon for production outcomes, and that's great. But if I do it, what's the added benefit in it in terms of the financial means? So when we need to offset our carbon, obviously we're looking at purchasing verified carbon credits that can be accounted in the system. And we're really fortunate here in Australia. We have a great program that you would have heard about, this acronym, the ERF, the Emissions Reduction Fund, and it's administered by the Clean Energy Regulator. And so this is the main avenue in Australia for landholders to earn income from a soil carbon farming project. I would add that there are a lot of these other verification systems in the international market, so Gold Standard, Vera, VCS, you may have heard of them, but certainly on the domestic front here in Australia, ACCUs, Australian Carbon Credit Units, are the best measure, and certainly one of the innovators in the space in terms of soil carbon. So Australian Carbon Credit Unit, 1 tonne of CO2 equivalent reduction, and that picks up Doris and Isabel's earlier slide about nitrous Nelly and carbon kid and methane man. So that's all your CO2 equivalent equals 1 Australian Carbon Credit Unit. So ACCUs can be contracted to the Australian government. It's a means that they use to offset what their emissions are. However, landholders may choose to go through that process and generate and verify a carbon credit, but also then sell it onto the voluntary market. So what does that market look like? Well, we're very fortunate. There was an auction just the other week, back on the 13th and 14th of October. And the big thing people always want to know is what's it worth. So the average price for ACCU at that particular auction was $16.94. And I'd say, interestingly, look at here the method types contracted. We're seeing a lot of vegetation agricultural methods coming through within the ERF as well. So what's that look like as a program as a whole? So if we're looking at what the ERF has done in its lifetime, it's about 210 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent, of which about 7% is being attributed to the agricultural methods at this stage, and that's about 15.1 billion tonnes of CO2 equivalent. The other thing I just want to point out on this slide is this thing around trend price. So it's nudging up towards about $17 for an ACCU. And while many would forecast it to go higher, particularly there's the voluntary market is paying a premium that's likely to push it up, you see over time it's not some significant jumps. So anyone who wants to do some crystal ball gazing, have a think about predicting what the future prices are, but certainly it's something to keep in mind that we're still sitting about $17 a tonne per hectare. Talking with some producers in other industries, that's very much not a great opportunity for some people to engage. But having said that, there's still voluntary markets where there is premiums being paid. So what are these options for a vegetable grower to engage within carbon markets? So there's 2 key options. There's above ground, so the vegetation, the great role through photosynthesis that our trees are doing to capture carbon from the atmosphere and store it. And there's also the below ground, the soil carbon. And that's what we're really going to talk about today. Now, as I mentioned, the ERF is unique. It's the first carbon credit program globally to adopt a soil carbon methodology. So, hats off to Australia for being innovators in this space and really leading the discussion and championing it through the way through. It's not to say it's the only one. There are a very close number of methodologies internationally that are exploring and testing at this space, but certainly right now it's the only one on the market. I'd also add that it's a very iterative process. There's a lot of learning going through in the way, and we've just seen recently the Australian Government Technology Investment Roadmap. It's highlighted soil carbon technology as a priority over the next 5 years. So what that means is we're going to start to see more accessibility around soil carbon methodologies, and that's reducing costs of monitoring and also improving the methodology and what it delivers. And probably another big exciting thing just to share that was announced last week is that a new priority for 2022 in methodologies is going to be an integrated farm method. So up until this point, if you were to register a carbon project, you could only do it above ground, so a vegetation project, or below ground soil carbon. You couldn't stack the methodology, so you couldn't treat that same piece of land into having 2 methods. So this certainly what we would maybe consider a bit of a game changer in the marketplace that's going to now stack methodologies for greater efficiencies at scale for producers. So keep an eye on that one as it comes into fold. So what are the current options in the Emissions Reduction Fund? I'm going to apologise for the blurry middle. I hate putting up slides if you can't read it, but this is an enormous decision support tree. So I'd really encourage you, if you want to look at this further, jump online, go to the Emissions Reduction Fund and type in opportunities for the land sector. So this is a really good, simple decision support tree that you can track through about what the options are to consider. So up on top, you'll see on this line, what are the opportunities? The bulk of these are vegetative related, except for this one on the far left, which is store soil carbon in soil. And as this is a Soil Wealth Integrated Crop Protection Project webinar, let's talk about soil carbon. The other thing I just want to point out is these blue boxes down the bottom. These are the approved methods within the Emission Reduction Fund that you need to follow in order to register and be generating carbon credits, Australian Carbon Credits, ACCUs, through your carbon project. So there are two methodologies. There's one that models your carbon, and I guess the word on the street is not really that viable. The estimations are too high. It doesn't enable a worthwhile representation. The one most people are going for are a soil carbon measured. So it's a combination of measured and modelled project that's coming through in the future. So if you were looking at doing a soil carbon project, the questions to ask yourself: one, are you looking at storing soil carbon in a grazing or cropping system, including perennial woody horticulture? Now you'll see that that particular wording references woody horticulture, not annual horticulture or vegetable farmers. And while it's not inclined, the system at the moment set up for veggie producers to engage, it's certainly theoretically possible to do that, and I'll talk about that in a second. The next question is, are you willing to undertake one or more new land management activities to increase soil carbon? And this is probably a bit of a real discussion point to touch on around additionality. So what additionality means is that you're not going to get a carbon project up through the Emissions Reduction Fund for just being a good farmer and doing what you're already doing now. And Doris and Isabel chatted on this already about what the activities are already underway within the vegetable industry about sequestering carbon. You're already doing that. Because of that, it's not offsetting emissions and there's no additional contribution to sequestration. So what you need to do in order to generate this is do a new eligible activity. And as you can see from this slider list, these activities are pretty geared up to broadacre cropping or pasture systems, so not particularly targeted at a vegetable farm. So some of these activities like re-establishing or rejuvenating a pasture by seeding establishment or permanently maintaining a pasture where there was previously no pasture, such as a cropland or bare fallow, probably not as appropriate for a veggie grower, but certainly where you're looking at applying ameliorants like a lime to remediate acid soils, gypsum for sodic soils, looking at some of the irrigation activities and practice changes, looking at conversion from intensive tillage practices to reduced no-till practices. There's certain practicalities there that could be adopted realistically within a veggie production system. I guess the 2 points I want everyone to think about as we think through that through a soil carbon project is the scale at which you could implement the change to maximise the carbon sequestration opportunity on your property, and also how disruptive would that be to your operation. It's not to say that these aren't good farming practices, but you're thinking about entering into a particular practice for a 25-year agreement. And that's a long time to look at keeping up and embracing the practice change through a contract with the government. So how to participate in the ERF. Look, this is a really simple diagram that's on their website. You identify a project, you register it, you deliver the project, you report against it, you claim carbon credits, and you get a cash check in the mail. Unfortunately, it's just not quite that simple. So I wanted to chat through what it actually looks like. And I'm going to share a little bit of data information here that it's a bit of back of envelope, a bit of it fell off the back of a truck. It's a very iterative process. This is constantly being updated all the time. But certainly just wanted to give you a really practical understanding of, if you are entering into a soil carbon project, what that actually really looks like. So I've looked over the fence at pasture because that's far more replicable examples, and this is using the method I referred to as the measurement of soil carbon sequestration in agricultural systems method. So first of all, keep in mind, life cycle 25 years, you've got to keep this up for the next 25 years. Registration costs $0, fantastic. So you can enter into register a project, not pay a cent. So that's a good start. Baseline. So you need to do a soil carbon baseline test, and this is to work out what is your current soil carbon content. And this is really, really variable. And this is some of the changes that are being made through the investment technology roadmap at the moment. But your variability is based on stratification. So vegetation types that you might have in your soil, management practices, topography, underlying geography, history of crops in that location. You also then have to undertake the practice change. Now, this isn't costing for pasture-based systems, so $50 to $350 per hectare. If we're looking at some of those activities in a horticulture or a vegetable system that we referred to earlier, and needs a lot of soil ameliorants and additives into the system, you're looking at possibly a greater opportunity cost to facilitate that practice change. So this is capital upfront out of your pocket. You've got to keep in mind. You've also got to think about, are you a carbon farmer or are you a vegetable grower? So there's a lot of work being done in this space, but learnings are coming out that there really needs to be a bit of support provided around capacity building and training. Some of the estimates from pasture systems are talking about $7,000 a year for the first 5 years, which is agronomic advice, but also support and the software updates to do your monitoring. Keep in mind that you're going to get an issuance every 5 years. So after issuance 1, 5 years later, you've then got to pay some sampling costs, and this is about 80% of your baseline, so $12 to $32 per hectare. You've also got to pay a once-off audit fee of $30,000, and that's just once off, no other issuances you need to do that. And then you need to apply some discounts. So automatically there's a 5% risk of reversal buffer that comes into play to swap the impermanents. And also this particular methodology has a 50% discount applied. So if you were to generate 100 verified credits, you can actually only sell 45% of them. So keep that in mind. And at a sale price of $16.94 an ACCU, it's something to think about the what goes into it. So just conscious that it'd be good to get to the panel discussion. Just want to weigh up some of these key options. So you've got to keep in mind the compliance costs, all those monitoring fees you need to do, the time commitment for you as a producer to be managing this project quite actively within your existing production system, but then on top of that, also the permanence obligations. We're talking 25 years. It's complex. Like, this is just a snapshot at this point in time. It's an evolving beast at the moment. And you've also got to guarantee the likelihood of the outcome. And Doris and Isabel touched on this really well, is that a lot of our soils already have a high volume of carbon content in them, or if they're not in an ideal location with rainfall and the cooler climate, their potential to sequester that carbon is quite limited in comparison to other regions. You've really got to change your management practices, and this is that additionality. You can't just do the status quo. You've got to be doing something quite significantly different. And you've got to keep in mind that opportunity cost. Does the income that you're going to generate from the sale of potential sale of carbon credits, does that exceed the project establishment costs? On the flip side though, what are the productivity gains? So, you can look at some of those other ecosystem services and functions that you will get in terms of improved soil health, the water holding capacity, soil biological function. You can also think about improved land value of your property as a result of the practice change. And then also whether this can access you into new markets. Can you certify or demonstrate to consumers that you're carbon neutral, or demonstrating good practice in terms of minimizing your carbon footprint? Also, you need to think about whether there's value of the diversified income stream from carbon credits. So second last slide, where to start. So I've adapted these from Lorraine Gordon from Southern Cross University, and also involved in the Regenerative Ag Alliance. I think this is probably a really good snapshot of what you need to consider. You need to assess the potential of your soils to sequester carbon. Are you in a good location to actually sequester carbon? Develop a carbon management plan. What's that practice change that you're thinking you might be able to undertake? And register the project before you commence any of those works. If you don't register it before you commence the works, it's no longer eligible. So that's a really critical step to keep in mind. You've got to complete your baseline soil testing and auditing, review that management plan annually and house tracking, get your external independent audit, and then after 3-5 years, you'll be able to sell it after you. So I said this was a rabbit hole. I hope people appreciate the Lewis Carroll reference here, but certainly it is possible within the Emissions Reduction Fund. But the practicality of it, well, look, I think that's a decision for each individual business to make. I think certainly issues of scale come into play with the horticulture sector, the opportunity costs of your change practices for high value crops and your gross margins within the production system. But also it's a changing space. So this is what's happening today, and what the opportunity is doesn't mean we're fixed. So it is a very much an evolving beast, and certainly a lot of opportunities changing going to the future. So certainly a watch and act space going forward. Thanks, Carl.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Clinton. That was an excellent and very practical overview too around where everything is up to with the Emissions Reduction Fund. And as you mentioned, very much a point in time. So Just a reminder to everyone that's joining us, feel free to type in those questions now as we move to our panel session. And I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce Dr. Francois Weiser from Carbon Friendly and Anthony Houston from Houston's Farms. Both of you, welcome. And also Doris and Isabel will be joining us on the panel along with Clinton too. So I'd just like to open with the question, Isabel and Doris, you mentioned around high percentage soil organic carbon earlier. I think a lot of people on the line would be very envious of those Flinders Island growers up around the 13, 14%. If you're on the sandier, loamy country in, you know, the north of Victoria or perhaps north on the coastal plain in Western Australia, sitting at around the 2 to 3%, what are the most practical steps that you can take to start building that soil organic carbon?
Well, I think if you're in a WA coastal plains with 2 to 3%, you're probably very happy about that. So the main thing is to really reduce the fallow. Try to grow cover crops if you can, because quite often you would have to irrigate them, and then irrigation or even fertilize them. So that's a bit counterproductive then if you want to accumulate carbon. Reducing fallow and reducing tillage and trying cover crops is probably the best you can do. And as I said before, we found that a lot of nitrogen use inefficiency in irrigated cropping. So that might be, we actually developed a nitrogen use efficiency calculator at some stage, and it's really interesting to see how much nitrogen and money is lost with nitrogen management or mismanagement.
Thanks, Doris. And you also mentioned too that efficient production systems or productive systems were those that were more efficient with their emissions. Anthony, I'd be really keen to hear your journey along this spectrum around carbon and broader soil health management too. Sorry, Anthony, you're just on mute as well. It wouldn't be a webinar or a meeting in 2021 without someone being on mute. There we go, we've got you.
Fantastic presentations, I learned so much. Yeah, just for those who don't know me, we used to be just baby leaf, so baby leaf lettuce and herb production. We've got farms in Tassie, processing facility in Tassie. And we supply Woolworths nationally, so we were sending product from here to Karratha 7 days on a truck, sending to Townsville from Tassie. And just listening to the presentations about how we could reduce our footprint or our carbon emissions. I don't know, 12 or 15 years ago, you know, it came out of a trip to the UK. We were learning about food miles, which you hadn't heard of before. Came back here and then realised it was carbon dioxide, and what a bad thing it was. So we did and Woolworths sponsored us to do a carbon footprint study back then, maybe, I don't know, 12, 15 years ago. And it was really interesting because 64% of our emissions came from transport. And it's not surprising because we were sending trucks to Karratha, to Darwin, to Townsville, all the way from Tassie. And the other big one, which I thought they were absolutely ridiculous, was they put fertiliser in. I said, we don't use any fertiliser. It's only minute amounts of fertiliser we put in per hectare per crop. And then they said it was 180 times worse than carbon dioxide. So that was, you know, so we thought, oh, better put it in. So I can't remember what fertiliser was, but it was something like 14% of our company. Electricity wasn't so big because our facilities are all renewable energy anyway, so even though we use a lot of energy. So the really big thing, the other one was that came out of the study was they said if you get your cost of production down per kilo, you know, you halve your cost of production, you're actually halving your footprint. I went, oh, rightio. So it came back to economics. So in lots of ways we forgot, and we just forgot about emissions because it wasn't on anyone's radar in Australia back then anyway. And So we just focused on cost of production. So it wasn't long after that we opened up a processing facility in Brisbane to supply. That supplied Brisbane and Queensland and New South Wales. And by already doing that, we were drastically reducing our footprint, our emissions, sorry. And since then, we acquired one in WA, in Perth, and then another one in Adelaide. So just by sheer economics is, the ridiculous amount of transport sending product from here to all these places. Just by opening up new facilities in each state, as the company grew, we couldn't do it unless the company grew. But so now it's a national company, and we've got farms in Tassie that only supply the processing facility down here. All the other facilities, like we've got growers in Queensland for the Brisbane factory, etc. Same in South Australia and WA. So that's where we saw, and when it came down to the soil, it would be more like, how can we not lose carbon because of all the things Doris and Isabel were talking about? You reduce your carbon, your crop yields are going to go down, and that's one thing we have really struggled with, because we've got very shallow soil here. We've got a bit of topsoil and 6 or 8 inches, or at the most 10 inches down you hit clay. So we've got very shallow soil. So we ended up growing very shallow rooted products like baby leaf, lettuce and spinach and rocket. Very shallow. So there's no root system at all. So we've pretty much been mining, I don't mind saying that, because that's got to change. And I can't lie with Doris sitting there watching it, because she's been watching what I've been doing. We've been mining the soil, and it's worked. We were told 30 years ago that we could not crop the soil; the soil was too poor. And now we've been doing it for 30 years, and we've got 600 people working for us now. So it has been successful, but to the detriment of the soil, which the guys are now out on the farm. They are changing. We were growing all year round, right? Trying to grow through winter. Now we don't. We just put it all back to grass in the winter. So anyway, that's probably enough for me for that question.
Thanks, Anthony. Some really good practical insights there. And I think from both the business and the growing perspective too. Francois, you used to grow organic lettuce in South Africa for over a decade. The retailers have been mentioned a number of times in the presentations today. I'm just wondering if you could comment on the importance and their role that the retailers play in this equation.
Sure. Am I muted, or can you hear me?
We can hear you. Thank you.
Yes, it was an amazing journey for us. We started with very poor soils, and really took us 5 years to get our soils to a condition where we could, grow a reasonable yields and an acceptable quality for the retailers. It was a massive effort in doing the composting, even compost teas and vermiculture. We tried all those things, worked through all those processes, but I think what made the biggest difference for us is when we went no-till. No-till vegetables was quite a radical thing to do in those days. But yes, that was for us was a massive change, and that's where we see people now going and that sort of going in that direction as well. But I think the retailers are paramount in making this happen. It's just the way farming is nowadays, that you produce, or you have to produce what the market wants, not what's good for your farm or good for the season or all that type of thing. So if the retailers can reward and support the growers that are doing the right thing and enable the consumer to be linked into and empowered in that process, we can see really massive change in the back end. And so we've developed a certification around, I guess we do carbon audits of crops and farms and that, but we've also developed a certified system whereby our product can now be certified as having been sustainably or more sustainably grown or produced, with that obviously a sustainability mark and the QR code that links to the grower and the story and that type of thing. So that's really where we're trying to go on the front end, is how do we support these growers to do more of the right thing, and how do the consumers can support them by buying more of their product and increasing their grower programs with the retailer. You know, what was always interesting for me is when the retailers said to us, look, I'm really just giving you the opportunity to sell your product. I'm allocating that shelf space to you, but you also have the obligation to make sure that the consumer wants your product and is going to buy more of it. So, you know, that's where I think we're coming in and saying, how do we support the growers to actually get that recognition and that demand, and so that the retailer would order more from them. But yeah, I'm hoping, and we're busy talking to the retailers in the space, but I hope that they're going to come on board and really provide that support for this to happen.
Thanks, Francois. We've had another question come through, and Clinton, I might direct this one to you because it was covered directly during your presentation. Was just, you mentioned the announcement around stacking of methodologies and just why that was significant, or what that actually means.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Carl. Look, it's a really good question. It was only come through in October, this new announcement. It's something that there's been a lot of lobbying work to do. So previous to that, you could only register a project on one piece of land as being above ground. So putting some trees in, revegetating or restoring bits of land, or protecting trees that currently would have been present, or having a soil carbon project in place. So changing some pasture regime, cropping practices, etc. What this stacked methodology is, it's an integrated land management method. It allows you to stack. So you can have a tree project and also a soil carbon project on the same bit of land. So it's actually a really great opportunity when you think about the auditing costs and the verification costs that comes with having a soil carbon project. You've got your one person who's coming out and undertaking those tests at the one time. So they're doing both, and you're able to generate and capture those credits from the same time. It's also pragmatic. It's really logical that if you're looking at a healthy production system, that it's working as a system. It's not just carbon being sequestered here and nowhere else on the property. So it really enables a greater incentive to participate in projects like this. So hopefully seeing good things. It's not official yet. It's just been listed as a priority for next year. But certainly that's a lot of excitement and energy around it.
If I can add there, Clinton, too, in terms of some of these production systems, they might not just be a one crop system, but several farms have different management systems. So as you say, like that system approach to consider different methods in a holistic way, so farmers can be awarded for their holistic good work. I kind of see it as a 2 or 3 for 1 scenario. So if you look at your diagram of cost, as you said, you can do all the changes, but just have one of the costs.
Yeah, it's a really good follow-up point. And to the one around different production systems too, we've had a question come in from Andy, and Doris, I might direct this to you in the first instance. Was just a question around, is it possible to actually grow a constant potato, carrot, onion rotation in your example, actually build soil organic carbon at the same time?
If between each crop you have a decent pasture phase, and then before you put potatoes in again, you have a cover crop. Yes, but if you would actually don't do anything in between to replenish the soil, either through growing a cover crop or pasture, we find in Tasmania pasture works really well. Cover crops, of course, are good because you can keep all the biomass. So without actually putting something in, it's just downhill, especially with root vegetables. So the thing is to again, maybe look like we looked at emissions and planning, and there's actually in Tassie a really good tool called Black Magic, and you can put in your management, and that's been developed years ago by Bill Cotching, our soil scientist. You can actually predict how your carbon is going to fare with certain management practices. And I quite like using that, because you can say if you keep going this way, it's going to go down or up.
And if I can add there, Carl, in terms of some examples for if you can actually do it, because probably everyone here is a vegetable farmer is going, that sounds all well and good, but what about my vegetable production? And just a plug for some of the resources that Soil Wealth is currently developing, which will include some examples both from Australia and overseas. I know there's a specific overseas example about a carbon neutral potato farmer from the UK, and we've got a carbon neutral corn farmer that we're producing a podcast about
If I can just add there, perhaps, Carl, we're also working with a sweet potato grower who's carbon neutral, I guess, but they have 2 cover crops after each harvest, one summer cover crop and one winter cover crop, and then the way they manage that and put the biomass back and everything, they manage to build their carbon in that system. But you could never do that if you go back-to-back root crops.
No. But the good news is, and I know also even from broadacre growers who use the cover crop principle, they make more money, growing a cover crop instead of a wheat crop. So if you look at not the annual income, but the 3 or 4 or 5 year income, you're doing better by having the breaks and preserving the soil. We did a huge survey over several years in Tassie on yield and marketable yield predictors for potatoes, and it was organic matter, organic carbon. So the pack, and we did one for carrots, and it was pasture breaks. So that was all about marketable yield and how you look after your soil.
No, thanks everybody. We have covered a lot of ground in 1 hour and no doubt could go for many more hours. However, we've got a commitment to get you out of here on time. I'd like to just point you to some additional resources and events. I mentioned at the start of the session, we've got 5 handouts there in the panel on your control bar there for GoToWebinar. Isabel's really neatly mentioned that there are a host of other products under development to support this webinar presentation as a package, all available through the Soil Wealth website. So other things up there that we've got around, best practice guides, case studies, there's demo site reports with practical data and insights from growers doing the doing, some fact sheets and global scans, and you can also watch back this webinar recording and others as well. But thank you very much for joining us. I'd also like to pass on a big thanks to our presenters and panelists. So Doris, Isabel, Francois, Anthony and Clinton, thank you very much for your time, but also such professional and practical insights too. It's been a really fascinating session. I hope everyone's found it really valuable, and we'll see you at our next Soil Wealth ICP event. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carl.
See you.